Alice Shields' music is called mind-boggling art, eloquent and intense, holds the listener spellbound by the New York Times, the Associated Press, and Musical America. She's one of the pioneers of electronic music and tells stories rich with the cultures of the world. Her acoustic and electronic operas and music for voices, instruments, and media weld together Western opera with non-Western classical forms, such as Japanese no theater and Indian Bharatanatyam, generating new forms of cross-cultural art. She's held positions as Associate Director of the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center and Director of Development of the Columbia University Computer Music Center, and has taught the psychology of music at NYU. She holds a doctorate in music composition from Columbia University, where she studied with Wladimir Ussachevsky, Jack Beeson, and Cho Wang-sung.
So I did my first electronic opera, which was Shaman 1987, was based on Native American shamanism. And in the case of this opera, every one of my other operas, I have essentially written the libretti and the music, of course, myself. In this case, I collaborated with my wonderful brother-in-law, who is a poet, Edward Barrett. And so he wrote for me the actual words that are sung in Shaman. I wrote the story kind of with him. And so what I have it's an electronic opera, and it's an hour and 5 minutes long, and the electronic part consists of a lot of electronically modified wolf sounds and coyote sounds. And in 1975, I got a National Endowment of the Arts grant to go out to, in this case, Utah and parts of Colorado, looking for coyotes to record. And eventually I did find one in Moab, Utah, who was kept chained because this family had originally saved a puppy coyote. Its mother had been shot, probably trying to eat chickens, in some farmer's yard. And so this coyote grew up, it was a female, and they let it go. It wanted to be wild, but it would keep coming back to visit them. And they got scared that it would be shot because there were, the farmers around them would try and protect their chickens. And so they kept it in the yard. This is desert yard on a huge leash. And it had dug a hole in the ground where it would stay like a cave, and it would come out, I think, at night. And so I finally was told that this family had this coyote, and they let me come into their yard, and I set up my recording equipment. I was with a friend, so we both sat there and imitated coyote sounds right over the hole where it was living. We couldn't see it. And eventually its head started coming out, the snout first, and this golden head appeared, and it put its head back and started singing with us. So I recorded this, still have the recording, and used a lot of that in creating the Shaman opera. So it consists of wolf calls, coyote screams, and manipulated human voices. The conductor was Douglas Anderson, who founded and perpetuated the American Chamber Opera Company, and they did such a fine job in premiering other new American operas with very, very fine, musicianship. I'm drawn to the classical music of different cultures. Indian classical, I spent 10 years in New York studying with very, very fine Bharatanatyam teacher who was both dancer and musician, Swati Bise and her company, and learned what I could of this incredibly difficult Indian music. Is very difficult, the classical stuff. You've got to be born into it from birth to develop your ear in this way. But it was wonderful. And eventually I was, after 3 years, she put me on stage for the first 2 years playing like dying kings because everyone was shorter than me, most of these Indian younger girls who were performing for her. So it was like an opera. I got to do the pants rolls and
Yes.
Bharatanatyam, the dying kings.
Incredible. Wow.
Anyway, so let's see. I think I answered. Oh, yeah, I didn't go into Mass for the Dead. No, you're going to ask me about that, I think.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah,
let's move on to the next one then.
yeah,
So many
good.
great things. So I noticed that your operas have a strong focus on evoking the full range of senses through many different artistic mediums, cultures, and religions to tell a story. One of the reviews by Shruti described your Mass for the Dead as a luxuriant yet eerily supernatural opera that convulsed the senses, and that it was a startling extension of the consciousness of India in an equally startling Western opera of the seen and unseen. Alex Ross also said he doubted there was a spookier opera in all of New York that year. Alex Ross from the New York Times.
Yeah.
Could you talk about how your inspiration for this opera and how you were able to evoke these senses?
Well, I based that opera very carefully on the Mass for the Dead, the Requiem Mass, and it does contain, I think, the basic identifying parts of a Requiem Mass, basically in Latin. And so I started there and structured the rest of it by studying my favorite piece, which is Bach's St. Matthew Passion, how he alternates the chorus with the soloists, the recitative with varying with the arias, and so on. So I tried to keep the formal structure very tight to try to increase the intensity. The piece it uses my voice reciting Greek and the translations of those Greek parts. So that's another case of relating to the classical music and poetry of a long gone but very foreign time, Greek culture. What did I want to say? Yeah. So it's a ghost opera. And what does that mean? Well, essentially, in August 1987, I had an interaction with an 18th century ghost. At least I thought I was having an interaction, and I think I was, with an actual ghost at an old farmhouse in the Rhode Island countryside, which was owned by my teacher, mentor, composer Vladimir Usichevsky and his wife Elizabeth Cray. And the nature of that interaction gave rise to me creating the plot for the electronic opera Mass for the Dead, in which a medium tries to free the ghost by evoking the power of female spirits. And I used as my female spirits the Greek Artemis, Demeter, Hecate, and the Christian Virgin Mary. Eventually, the medium succeeds, and the ghost seems to go on to hopefully a happier beyond. And the piece the electronic part is extremely simple compared to my chamber music or notated, music for live instruments. But it's the Requiem, the Gregorian chants, and that are incredibly beautiful and pure and very painful if you hear them in certain ways, very moving. So those melodies were given me, but I played with them and changed them until I was satisfied. And it seems that it is pretty but scary when people see it. So I guess that is in English, Latin, and Greek. The English is from little parts of the St. James Bible. And the Greek is what I've said before. It's actually poetry and parts of Aeschylus plays that deal with these same figures. Yeah, I guess that's all about Mass for the Dead. Guess we, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Wonderful. Um, another aspect of your works I would like to discuss is your use of language within your operas. I know we spoke a bit about earlier about viewing language beyond its more utilitarian and literal meaning. For example, in your opera Criseyde, which you call feminist revenge rewrite, you gave Criseyde power and autonomy despite the fact that she was quite powerless by societal and social standards. What
Uh-huh.
specific adjustments did you make to change the original tone from Chaucer's Troilus and Criseyde?
Right. It was an interesting task. So the opera, as I have it, is in Middle English, but as I was working on the libretto, Chaucer deliberately left his plot in the middle of things. He deliberately did that. And what he did with his lead character, Criseyde, aside from Troilus, was implied that she had gone off to the Greek camp. If anyone reads, the story, it ends with Criseyde apparently going off to the Greek camp and seeming to link to a new man because Troilus was no longer available. So that's what Chaucer did to that character that he himself took from Boccaccio's story. He translated almost word for word Boccaccio's Il Filostrato, which means he who is prostrated with love. And in Boccaccio's story, his Criseyde character is quite powerful, quite dynamic character, almost an equal participant with Troilus in terms of trying to keep their love going. But what Chaucer did is take out of Boccaccio's story, he did not translate and keep many, in fact, most, I think, of the statements of Boccaccio's Criseyde that clearly make her a dynamic character. So I put them back in Boccaccio's Italian. And so I'm using Renaissance medieval Italian, which is not that far from modern Italian. It's much closer than Middle English is to modern English. Chaucer's English is much further away. So even, I believe, someone knowing modern Italian could immediately understand those words. Whenever I bring in Boccaccio's powerful words of Criseyde for my Criseyde to speak and sing, I quiet down the entire orchestra and have only sustained strings, so it's very quiet, and you can hear what's going on. You can hear Troilus responding to her, which he could not in Chaucer's piece, because Chaucer's text, as beautiful, this is beautiful poetry that he wrote, but he was a man of his time, as Shakespeare was, later with his own Criseyde, who turned into a whore, based on what Chaucer had done to his character. So I resurrected, as it were, Criseyde's intellect and emotional focus. And eventually, all the men in this piece, it's almost comic at the end, though it isn't experienced that way, because I killed off all the men and she lives on. It's my revenge for being a woman composer.
I loved the ending. I absolutely loved it. I was like, wow, this is incredible.
She actually, if they could stage it, one of my versions of staging the very end is she sings this aria to the dying Troilus, the opposite of most 19th century operas. He's dying and she's trying to help him.
It's incredible. I mean, even listening to one of the arias, I think it was the engagement scene.
Yes.
And hearing the way you wrote the line for the singer was just absolutely stunning and completely empowering. the way you used the language, you knew that she had control in that situation. And here, at
Yes.
least. Yeah.
And thanks for bringing up the language changes again, too, because part of what I did, and I had to consult someone who did know Middle English, as knowing German, at least on paper, not to speak it, but fairly well, it's pretty easy to figure out much of what's going on in Middle English. It's very close to modern English and it's close to modern German, or in part, it's easy to figure out. However, I took words out of Chaucer's Troilus and put them in the mouth of my crusade, because almost all of, there's very little in Chaucer's crusade, that character, that she actually says, that the reader of the poem can tell what's going on in her mind. There's no description of her thoughts, but there is like exquisite description of Troilus's every tinge of emotion or twinge of emotion. You hear it and it's beautiful. There's just nothing for her. So it's like a mystery. She doesn't really think. That's what it comes over as beautiful as the language is. And it is truly beautiful. But the character is not a whole human being. And so I made her so, I believe. So what I had to do is consult someone who did know, in detail, could teach Middle English, to change the gender parts of nouns and verbs, which were still used in Middle English, so that it was appropriate for my crusade, and was taken from Troilus's mouth and put in hers. Yeah. What else is there? Yeah. Let's see. I was thinking of my opera Apocalypse, because one other thing you had asked me earlier was, well, we talked a little about using electronic media, but if you don't mind, if we talk for a moment about
No,
Apocalypse,
absolutely.
great.
Absolutely.
Okay. So that opera, which is an outrageous thing, I don't know, I had to write it, but it is outrageous. And it's like having, a sibling that you don't quite understand, but you have to be in the same room with. It took, years to write it because it's a 2-hour-long piece, or almost 2 hours. It is a ritual opera with heavy dance component. And in it, because by that point I'd been in studying and performing in Bharatanatyam, Hindu dance drama, for 4 years or so. I choreographed it using Bharatanatyam choreography. It's essentially one of those multicultural things again, in which I use both Greek and, in this case, just a word or two of Sanskrit, some of which I got from, the dances, the music of which I had to learn to a certain degree in Bharatanatyam. And so it also has Irish in it, modern Irish Gaelic, which I got from a travel book, how to speak in Irish Gaelic, and checked it with my sister because she has a degree in Irish and Welsh, so I could check it with her. And so essentially that piece hovers around enlightenment through a woman seeking enlightenment. This is fantasy, not at all realistic stuff. Using as models the Greek god Dionysus and the Hindu god Shiva, the lord of the dance. And she goes through various consultations with a character called the Seaweed, who speaks in Irish, because there's a lot of seaweed and sea stuff in Ireland. Let's see. So that is an opera too. That piece, as much as could fit on a CD, came out with New World Records, and is readily available. Also, for New World Records, you can actually download, the PDFs of libretti and stuff free, which is great.
That's great to
Um,
know. I did
yeah,
not know that.
yeah, you can. Let's see, is there's anything else I wanted to say about that? In that piece, I heavily used my own voice, which I recorded with an engineer at Harvest Work Studio, and changed it so that I have several characters in there who I deliberately lowered the voice somewhat and made it more not identifiable by gender quite. So there's a baritone, Michael Wilson, who I have singing in that CD version, and I have myself singing as I actually sang as, mezzo, and a version of myself, particularly in the penultimate scene, which is called Organ Screaming for kind of obvious reasons. They're working up to a Tibetan Mayathuna, which is sexual intercourse at the end of the opera. It's a kind of essay in the use of the voice in a long dramatic piece. Apocalypse is heavy on the theatrical and dance side, and on the music side, it's fairly simple, both the electronic and parts and the live singing.
Mm.
Yeah, and do I need to say anything about the Greek?
Oh, it's a very unique piece. It was reminded me a lot of the melodrama tradition that started way back with Rousseau, where it was alternating between the music, just straight theater, and having some dance in there as well.
Yeah, yeah, good comparison.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
Okay.
they are dressed as an ancient Greek tragedy at the end, and masked, heavily masked.
Mm.
So it's, yeah, so that's Apocalypse, and it, it would be a dance company probably that really should premiere the stage version of it eventually.
Yeah, that'd be
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
Um, great.
right.
So
So
next question.
yeah.
Um, I would actually like to discuss your most recent opera, the environmental revenge opera Zhao Jun, The Woman Who
Uh-huh.
Saved the World, which follows the concubine Zhao Jun as she travels through time to save the world from a corrupt emperor in the 21st century. It's pretty obvious from the preface of this piece and others that you care deeply about the state of the environment and protecting our planet. Could you discuss your inspirations behind creating this compelling story and the many other themes in this work you want to strongly convey?
Yes, thank you. One of my attractions around the world is to Tibetan Buddhism, particularly, not like many forms of Buddhism, not necessarily focused on afterlives or gods, but on self-improvement mentally and spiritually. And the figures in Tibetan Buddhism are the bodhisattvas, which are the people who have supposedly attained enough enlightenment to become Buddhas and leave this form of reality. But the bodhisattvas stay around supposedly to enlighten others and bring everyone to Buddhahood, to enlightenment. So seeing those statues of various of these and the tankas, the paintings and illustrations, the women in them, as in some, Hinduism itself, Buddhism came out of Hinduism, and Hinduism, at least in part, has heavy parts of Hinduism that are Shakti based, they're female based, goddess based. And I guess that perhaps went over heavily into Tibet when Buddhism, spread to Tibet, it spread east. So I set up this plot as I was thinking about it. I wanted to bring the bodhisattvas into our lives at this point, beyond Tibet and beyond the past, to help us save the earth because we're destroying it. And in my lifetime, I see the huge difference. Just living in New Jersey as a kid, back then, it truly was the green, the Garden State. When you crossed from New York City over the George Washington Bridge to New Jersey, as soon as you landed, there were farms, green farms, far as you could see. Within a few years, we were still kids, my sister and I noticed, oh, they're gone. And it's all asphalt very fast. And then the woods started disappearing where there were still horse pastures. Believe it? Not now. And that, so I grew up with that and watching it like anyone else who was alive in that period. What is happening? You know, this unbelievably beautiful place, this country, you know, which was maintained so well by the native peoples till we swamped them out here and pushed them into reservations. It's being destroyed. Just the beauty was coming down. You know, the trees were diminishing. These streets, you know, the national highway system began when I was a kid, when Eisenhower was president. And truly, that must have helped a lot in the country. But what it did is wipe out individual differences around the country, just as later the national media did, so that the precious little differences that different communities find over time, both in just the way they spoke English was a richness, you know, it wasn't the way you spoke it. Oh, that's interesting. The tones of the voice, the other characteristics were wiping out a very simple form of diversity. Anyway, so
Heartbreaking.
yeah, so that the Jajun, the woman who saved the world, is based around let's stop destroying it, because we're obviously these last few weeks we see it here in New York too.
Mm-hmm.
It's really heating up, you know,
Very
and
much so.
very much, and you know that particularly
Yes.
right today because
Yeah, my
you had
apartment
a
flooded.
flood, right?
Yep. Except for this area, because this interview is very
Right.
important and we need to get this out.
Right.
Um,
Right. So essentially in Jajun, the opera, um, I'll just describe the roles and that's it. There's the singing role, soprano is Jojun. There was an actual woman of that name, a historical woman who lived around the year 33 BC, Roman times in the West. And she was a concubine of the then Han Emperor. He had many concubines. And she was sold away by him or given away as a political gift to the Xiongnu tribes, these large numbers of different peoples who were nomadic, who we might call Mongolian today, but I think it was not clear because there were many different tribes. And so this historical woman lived the rest of her life there. Subsequently, for since then, 2,000 years of writing using her image, various playwrights and novelists wrote beautiful plays based on an imaginary, personality for her. They didn't know her. And so I used her as a kind of quintessential female figure, used for her body, even at the level of an emperor. You are a slave, you are a sex slave. As even in medieval Europe, the females of royal families were political pawns, just as Crusade was, and Troilus and Crusade, and used for their political heft. So she was, and I call her in the opera, a sex slave. That's a huge thing in contemporary life. There sex trafficking of women and girls. There are, grand juries meeting in Manhattan frequently over this kind of thing. We may not see it, all of us, but it's big time and it's there, digitally assisted. So I have Jajun as the soprano. She leads a group of women who I call the dressers, because they dress and redress her as different bodhisattvas during the opera. And they follow her and try to help her And I deliberately say in the libretto that Jajun can be of any race, of any color, in any costume, and so can her activist army, the dressers. They represent women around the world, women trying to save the world.
Mhm.
And so Jajun poses 3 times in the opera as different bodhisattvas to threaten the emperor into casting away his armaments, his garbage, and his money. And eventually she gets him because as she's chasing him, he falls into his own pollution, his garbage that he carries on his, and dies. She brings him back to life because she wants him to change and not escape her into death. And he comes back and she enlightens him by showing him the molecular structure of the universe, that everything is reflected, a hologram of everything else. And they dance at the end, and he's relatively safe again. But essentially, they're doing this. It'd take too much time to explain, but the emperor's soul is also played by the same guy who plays the emperor. And he and Jajun are essentially, for the public, reenacting the how she brought the emperor to enlightenment for the public. So this whole opera is a reenactment, a deliberate reenactment.
Mm.
And when it was done, so far it was done in concert, form, not stage, though I did have a director to help the readings as people, were sitting in chairs. Yeah, so that piece, I intend to get it done.
Yes.
Staged. Yeah.
Very important piece. Very relevant, as most of your pieces actually are, truly. So moving forward in your career, what is a message you want to convey to your audiences?
That's a difficult thing to say in words, because for a musician or for a writer of stories, as I also am, it's the story, it's the piece itself, of course, that's the message. But underneath it, I guess, often in my work, I would like the world to be, the human world at least, a more empathic place that we can survive together and not overpopulate and destroy the rest of the world and all living beings other than humans. And I guess sort of injustice makes me want to write. But beyond that, the beauty of sound, and the reason I really loved becoming a singer as long as I did, was the ecstasy of being on stage, both yourself and portraying something else, and surrounded by unbelievably beautiful sound. And the one time I actually had the ability to sing in a Wagner opera, though I did some with orchestra, but on stage, was Die Walküre with the Washington Opera, with Antal Doherty conducting. And standing on stage with the horns, they face the stage, and the sound was better than you could ever hear. And this glorious, to me, that opera of, he really did a good job in that opera. There's very little I would edit out of that Wagner opera.
Yeah.
And the glory of feeling like you're beyond human life for a moment, just a moment, dwelling in some other eternity, is reassuring in some way.
Wow.
So, yeah. So if people want to know more about my work, they can go to my website. That's aliceshields.com, or contact my publisher, which is the American Composers Alliance. And the phone number for that is 212-837-8082. And thank you for interviewing me, Christina.
My pleasure. It's truly an honor to be here with you and to learn from you.
Thank
Very
you so
inspired.
much.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Great.